Hello everyone and welcome back to Into Battle with me, Simon Holland-Roberts, and my good friend Mr.
Hi.
Phil Baxter.
Hello.
Hello again. We're motoring through these series, but we're coming to a big one today, which is, one of the most prolific battles of certainly our modern times, and it is the Battle of the Somme. In my knowledge, it's just, I again, as a complete layperson, it conjures up like the epitome of the horrendous nature of war. It's mud and blood and guts and just all kinds of figures and stats of just utter devastation and yeah. So where do we start with the Somme? Where's it come from? What is the Somme? Where is it geographically? And let's start at the beginning.
If you there's this Julie Andrews thing. Let's start at the very beginning, the very good place to start, and whatever. As you unpeel the onion of your understanding of the First World War and its effect on the country and its history, it's really important sometimes to sort of, I think, just to reflect a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The country itself, Britain, ostensibly wasn't particularly different during the period of the First World War. So if you lived in the village where we live, things wouldn't have been distinctly different. You still would have gone to your work, you would have done your job. There were no air raids where we were. May have been a little bit of shortage of some goods now and again, but it was all the same. The people who went to fight in the war, when they came home, there was very much a sort of corporate feeling of the war was the war and home was home, and we didn't burden people at home with the horrendous the experience of this thing we were doing called the war.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very, very separate. But if you asked a person today, somebody who didn't know anything about the First World War, tell me what you know about the First World War, and you asked 100 people, they say one of the key words that will always come out is Somme. And as you said at the start of it, the Somme is now a sort of a watchword for the suffering, the agony, the mud, the blood. The other word that might come out is Passchendaele,
Mm-hmm.
which was another battle a year or so later. The reason why the Somme comes out more than anything is it was an absolute blockbuster.
Right.
A guy called Geoffrey Malins and his assistant filmed the Big Push, as it was called. The Big Push. The Somme was it. We were going to take the sledgehammer and smash the Germans and break the line and win the war. It was everything. And the War Office, the people running the war, the government running the war, said, we'll get this filmed. And Geoffrey Malins and his friends went out to France and they filmed the soldiers beforehand. They actually took combat footage, some of the first combat footage ever recorded.
Wow.
Live combat footage of the action unfolding.
Mm-hmm.
And it came back to Britain, and it was a box office mega film.
Right.
I can't remember the proportion of people, but it's along the lines of like 6 out of 8 people in Britain watched the film. Or so. It was hugely popular.
Wow.
So much so that the Battle of the Somme actually dragged on for a lot longer than it was hoped for.
Mm-hmm.
So much so that Malins actually made another film later on called The Battle of the Ancre towards the end of the Somme campaign, about 8 months later.
A sequel,
and that was shown in the cinema as well.
God.
And it was, this is what makes it. It was the first time civilians had seen a war.
Right.
It might have been in silence. It might have had subtitles. It might have had somebody at the front playing a piano,
Mm-hmm.
but they saw it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the start of the battle was the worst day of casualties that the British Army has ever suffered.
Wow.
And in the space of about, say, 6 hours, for about 7 o'clock-ish in the morning till, say, 1 o'clock-ish in the afternoon, most of them occurred. On a 30-kilometre front, the British Army suffered somewhere in the region of 59,000 casualties, of which probably 19,000 were fatalities.
59,000
casualties. Wounded, killed,
That's like
lost.
Wembley.
It's a football stadium full of people.
Yeah.
Football stadium full of people. And that was a tremendous shock. So not only was this film, the film didn't come out immediately, but what happened was the first day of the Battle of the Somme occurred, and within, a day or two, Britain was receiving casualty lists that were just masses of casualties, and this was unusual. This hadn't really occurred in the same way in the war, so it is ingrained not only, and there's something I'll allude to a bit later on, towards the end of this podcast, but it became ingrained in the sort of the psyche of the nation that this was a great thing and a disastrous thing and a new thing, and it just had that sort of thing about it that it became so commonly known. And it's a battle that lasts a long time. It lasts through into the late autumn, to the November sort of time, having started in July. It's a big chunk of time that the fighting goes on as they slowly push the Germans.
But day one, it just kind of started with like a seismic like event horizon, just went bam, and that was and what was that? Was that to do with planning? Was it how did they just go? Well, I mean, explain. I mean, that just seems.
Yeah, we sort of, like I say, you have to sort of see the big picture sometimes, however you want to explain it. But Britain goes to war on 4th of August 1914. We send our British Expeditionary Force, our rapier amongst scythes, our super-duper army off to France. It gets battered, gets used up. Its combat power disappears. We start to augment that and replace those soldiers with our trained reserve, the Territorial Army, which volunteer for overseas service.
Yeah.
We bring back parts of other armies that were scattered across the empire, say back from India.
Right.
We bring in Dominion and Indian troops to fight, and they kind of fight through 1915. But during 1915 is the time when all those volunteers that joined at the very start of the war are being trained and shaped and formed into military units.
Okay.
So, excuse me, we're looking at things like simple soldiers, have a rifle, have a tin hat. They're relatively simple to train. But if you're thinking about artillery, quite complex roles, medical staff, logistics, support, combat service, you've got to train all these soldiers on a big, even though it's a long time ago, it's a modern type army.
Yeah.
And you've got to train everybody into these roles. As I said, a bit like the pandemic.
Yeah.
Not everyone can suddenly become a respiratory nurse expert.
Absolutely.
You've got to train them. So this is taking place all the way through 1915. And by 1916, a thing called the New Army is coming into formation. And this is Kitchener's New Army, composed of all these people who volunteered.
Kitchener being
the man on the poster, your country needs you.
Yes.
And remember I said the war will be over by Christmas? Well, Kitchener was the guy who knew it was going to take 3 or 4 years to get it done.
And he was like,
so when Britain said, we need to recruit a couple of 100,000 men, Kitchener said, you need to recruit 3 million.
Yeah, okay.
So he's built this army. So now we have this superb army that we think it's ready to rock and roll. What are we going to do with it? Well, the French. Remember last time we were talking about the French in Artois, the Battle of Loos, Battle of Loos? Yeah, the French have fought in Artois. The French have used a lot of combat power. And they're struggling a little bit. They're having quite a hard time. And they want the British to take on a bigger role. You come on, Britain, you've got a bigger army now. You can take on more space, can't you? Yeah, okay. Well, what we'll do then is we'll sort out an offensive. The French will do the big attack. The British will support that attack a bit further in the north, and that's how we use your big army. But the Germans spoil it. The Germans attack the French a bit further south at a place you might have heard of called Verdun.
Verdun.
So the Germans attack at Verdun with, once again, you speak about the horror weapons, the bad weapons, the bad way. The Germans attack at Verdun, Operation Gericht, and their aim is not to beat the French. Their aim is to engage the French, and von Falkenhayn, the guy in charge of it, his aim is to bleed France white. So it's to attack. He gets Prince Ruprecht, to attack at Verdun with a view to get the French into an attritional battle, take some of their land, and force them to take it back and just keep killing them. So the French, this happens just before this big attack that was going to take place. The French have to reconfigure everything. And they say to the British, look, you're going to have to take on a bigger role. We need to take more men out of the line to support Verdun. Blah, blah. And so the Somme offensive kind of evolves from a supporting attack to suddenly being a big attack.
Right.
And you've got the wherewithal to do it because you've got the new army.
Yeah.
You've got a load of people ready to rock and roll. You've got, your shell crisis is kind of sorted out.
Right.
let's go for it, And so the British agree at a political level they'll support, and that's the genesis of the Somme offensive, effectively, to support France while France is being destroyed by the Germans at Verdun.
Oh God! So it's a wholly British attack.
There's a little bit of French involvement at the south, but the main thrust of the battle is British, and it's the new army essentially.
New army, and
essentially.
People being. We're going to touch later on in a different podcast, I'm sure, on the kind of the certain regiments and the PALs and all that kind of stuff. But just to give us a flavour of that, of the kind of I know we've got a few testimonials and things, and a few little bits and bats that we've got here. It's often good to look at like contemporary recollections or contemporary documents about this time. Is there any particular ones that you think would be appropriate?
I think to get a bit of a feel for it, like I say, you can't really do things justice. The magnitude of them is too big, and they're so potentially so well documented, so many things, that to try and understand the magnitude of it all at one go is too big. So I think I'd like to just sort of pick one small slice of action for today.
Absolutely.
Like I say, use a couple of bits of testimony and whatever.
Yep.
And it's a very, very famous one. There's a picture that many people will have seen, but I say I want to just frame the battle really in sort of the context of how not so much it evolved, but what happened. The Germans, as I said, had taken the land that they wanted. They wanted to keep it firm,
right.
And so on the Somme, they've been on the Somme for about 18 months. The Somme area near Albert in France, and they had built very, very effective defences. And it's very much a case that if you're so I'm just sorting my papers out here. If you're one of these people like I do who goes to battlefields and walks the ground, you see where their trenches are positioned, and they're exceptionally well thought through. They're all on reverse slopes, so they're all just beyond the crest of a hill.
Right.
I was saying about the British artillery's skill was there to fire at things they could see.
Yes.
So the Germans' positions are always in positions that are awkward to see. They're always in positions where if you attack one of them, ones that are near you can fire at the enemy as well to support them and stuff. And so it wasn't an ideal battle for the British to fight because the Germans were quite well prepared. And one of their huge preparations, if I just pop this on the table, were these things. They built deep underground bunkers, deep underground troop shelters.
Okay.
And we're not talking about 10-foot underground. We're talking about maybe 50 feet underground.
That's deep.
They're super deep. And so even with the most effective artillery of the day, then they're not going to be vulnerable to being killed easily.
Right.
They're not going to be vulnerable to killed at all, possibly in some of these deep shelters.
Right. So they've been there, and how long would it have taken them to do this? Because it seems like that's a lot of engineering.
Yeah, but they've been there for 18 months, and unlike I was saying about the trenches systems when we were talking about the gas attack, the Germans made trenches to stay. The Allies made trenches to be temporary because we want to progress.
Okay.
So it meant that Allied troops could spend less time in the front line because just of the physical attrition of being in the cold and the wet and the misery. But the Germans could stay a long time. So the Germans kept the same troops in position for months on end.
Right.
So they got to know their sector really well.
Right.
So they had time to dig bunkers and dugouts. They had time to rehearse their stand-to drills. If the enemy attack, what do we do? They had time to rehearse possibilities. And whereas the British would go into the line every 3 or 4 days, they'd come out of the line and go into the line, and then a division would move somewhere else.
So they're transient.
And that gave the Germans all the cards. To use the Trump thing, the Germans had all the cards in their favour at this point. But the British had to attack because the French needed support.
So how did they do that?
Well, they decided to adopt a simple plan. Have you heard the military saying, KISS, keep it simple, stupid?
Okay.
They devised a mechanised battle plan.
Mechanised?
It was a machine, and each of the pieces of the machine would do their task, and then the whole machine would work. So what we will do is we will bombard the German lines into dust. We will pulverise the German defenders into atoms with artillery, and then our infantry will advance in a slow and steady and particularly, organised way and occupy the German trenches. And then we will do the same again. And then eventually we'll have broken through the 2 or 3 lines of German trenches and we will wade through and get to the green fields beyond and roll up the German army.
And how does that manifest on the first day?
It doesn't quite go as they expect.
Oh, no.
They make the preparations, and it doesn't quite go as they expect. And one place I'd like to look at, it's actually on the map that we've got in front of us, is a place called Hawthorne Ridge, which is near a little village called Beaumont Hamel. And you can go there today. It's easily accessible for you to go there today. And you can see the ground. Okay, it's now covered in nice, pleasant trees and bushes, and nobody's getting killed. But it looks very, very like the ground today. And if you just look at that little slice of it, the Germans are ensconced and camped on the Hawthorne Ridge as part of their trench line. So if I just pop this on the table. And that's an aerial view of the Hawthorne Redoubt. You can see the trenches in that little sort of rectangular pattern at the top. Okay. And that is on the top of a hill. It's probably, 50 feet high, maybe the hill, 100 feet high. But it's quite a dominating position. Okay. And it looks out over the British trench lines. Right. So if the British are going to attack, they're going to have to remove the Hawthorne Ridge Redoubt. Right. The original plan was to use artillery, but the British haven't got enough artillery. So in some key locations, and Hawthorne Ridge is one of them, they decide to use an ancient medieval technique of undermining. Right. So, we've got Conway Castle near us. One of the ways you could, or Beaumaris or Rutland, where one of the ways you could undermine a castle, one of the ways you get into a castle, dig a tunnel under the walls, fill it full of timber, Fred Dibner style, to support it up, then set fire to the timber falls into the hole, the castle wall drops in on top of it, and then you're into the air. So they're going to use the same sort of concept, but instead of burning some bits of wood and the whole thing falling in, they're going to pack it full of quarrying or some other type of explosive,
TNT,
and blow
the whole hill
thing to sky high. Rather like I'm going to go to Llanberis and blow up the slate quarries to get some slates. I'm going to go to Beaumont Hamel and blow up Hawthorne Ridge and remove all the possibilities of the Germans ever shooting at me, because they'll have smashed them to atoms and turned them into vapour.
That is brutal.
And they did this in a number of locations on this first day of the Somme as a combat power multiplier. If they could get a few key locations and just destroy them outright, that would fit in with their mechanised plan that the infantry will then move forward and occupy these positions, and there won't be too much of a fight, because even though I say like the infantry have got a rifle and a bayonet, and they're essentially civilians in military clothing, and we want to make it as simple as possible for them. Even to the point that before the battle, a lot of the soldiers are in the rear areas training. They actually go over taped out, like the police crime tape. They tape out in fields the positions of the German lines and give them names and whatever. So, and the soldiers rehearse across. That's how mechanised their battle plan was. Right. Yep. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to blow this thing up, and then the infantry will come forward. But it's not always that simple.
No. What is that?
So, remember I was saying about this guy who films the thing, Geoffrey Malins? Yeah. This is a pieced together bit of modern photo and old photo. This is Hawthorne Ridge when the mine that's underneath it, as it's called, gets detonated. That's a sort of a melding together of an old photo and new photo. This was actually taken by Malins as part of the moving images that were shown in British cinemas. Right. Yeah. So
that's the explosion.
That's the explosion. Yeah. So
I never knew this. I never knew they did this. I just thought in my head it's just
that's because
people marching over trenches.
When you were living a normal life, I was nerding my way around the Somme, and
that's, ladies and gentlemen, why we do a podcast. Well, I mean, that is huge.
Yeah, it was. There was all sorts of absurdities, like the explosion was heard 7,000 miles away. But it's a big bang.
It's shock and awe, isn't it? It's like going, this is a statement, deal with it. I mean, and again, like with the gas, like when Germans first hit with the gas, they never saw that coming.
No. They had
So
a
how
few.
big it- so they-
This wasn't new. Mining had occurred in other parts of the front,
Right.
and the Germans probably had some degree of understanding that
Right.
this was happening. The build up for the Battle of the Somme wouldn't have gone beyond the Germans noticing. They would have had aircraft seeing numbers of things building up and supply dumps, and they would have known a push was happening.
Right.
But they weren't aware, and they certainly weren't aware enough to evacuate to avoid the casualties, because they were unaware of when this would happen.
Right.
But they were made aware, which I'll talk about in another podcast. They were made aware inadvertently.
Okay.
So this thing's going to go up, and as soon as this goes up, the infantry will move forward. They will occupy the German trenches that have been devastated by the artillery. The Hawthorne Redoubt's been knocked out, and it's going to be great. Then Hunter Bunter gets involved.
Who?
Sir Alma Hunter Weston, who was the 29th Division's commander, the commander of this area of the front.
Right.
Hunter Bunter wasn't really very much of a scientist, and so Hunter Bunter decided that he was going to try and blow the mine up earlier than needed, because he was worried about the troops getting hit by falling debris. So the attack was all planned all along the front to happen at 7:30 in the morning. Hunter Bunter wanted to blow up the mine the day before,
Right.
but was eventually convinced not to,
Right.
because of the loss of surprise.
Yeah.
But he decided to blow it up 20 minutes past 7 rather than 30 minutes past 7, so 10 minutes before the attack. I'm not too sure about Hunter Bunter's scientific understanding, but I do wonder how far did he think the rubble was going to go that it would be in the air for 10 minutes.
Oh.
If you would have blown it up maybe 2 or 3 minutes earlier, that sounds a bit more believable to me. But 10 minutes was no. So they did destroy the Germans who were there, pretty much most of them, but they didn't destroy the Germans who could then infiltrate into the crater and man the rim of the crater. So the net outcome was that the Hawthorne Ridge Redoubt wasn't really eliminated.
Oh no!
It became a machine gun base.
It became a hole.
It became a base of fire as it was before, but now it was just a giant hole rather than being a series of complex trenches. It was just now a big crater.
Don't tell me they just all piled in.
Well, no, the Germans were able to get through the crater and get up onto the rim of the crater, scrape away a bit of soil, so they effectively had the same protection as being in a trench.
They had a massive trench.
They still had the same view downhill into the British positions, and they still had big machine guns and lots of ammunition. So the whole thing didn't really solve the battle problem.
So how the drop in that? Well, how would that 10-minute difference? Would the British troops been prepared to would they have got in to?
No, the British waited.
They instead of going in.
7:30. So yeah, it was basically a pre-warning to the Germans, and they had 10 minutes to get ready.
Oh God!
So that was the disaster. The other part of it was, do you remember when we were talking about the shrapnel shells not being able to cut barbed wire and stuff?
Yeah.
The British fired, 1.3 million shells or something. It's over 1 million shells along the whole of the front.
Right.
Many of them were those shrapnel shells, which didn't destroy the wire.
No.
And the high explosive shells they used, they developed high explosive. They thought high explosive would be good for blowing this up, but there were problems with the high explosive shells, as we were talking about off camera, about the fusing in them, causing failures in the shells.
Premature.
Yeah, premature. So they'd go off in the guns. So the gunners weren't able to fire the fire plan for a whole host of reasons. But essentially, the fire plan didn't destroy the German lines.
Right.
And in that first picture I put out, the Germans were in bunkers 50 foot deep anyway.
So that's not going to harm them.
So whilst it might have been grim for the 7 days of the bombardment they faced, they weren't in danger of them actually being killed.
No.
So Hawthorne Ridge goes up. You don't hide an explosion that big, even in the midst of an artillery bombardment. So troops for 3 or 4 miles either side of it knew something was happening because the mine had gone up. So it just alerted the whole of the German line.
Right.
So then the British soldiers climb out of their side of the battle, and their job is, in our mechanised battle, to walk across in straight lines, carrying with them some stuff to defend the trenches they're going to capture. So they're going to capture some blown up to bits trenches. So they'll take a few digging tools with them, some bits of barbed wire, blah, blah, go across, capture those lines, secure them, and then the next wave of troops will come through the first wave of troops, and then go on and repeat the process again, and then eventually we'll have got through the German lines and we'll win. But it didn't work out that way.
Because they showed their card.
Because the first day of the Battle of the Somme, it's a big front, 120,000 troops, 130,000 troops say maybe attack him. Of those 130,000, about 59,000 become casualties on the first day, and most of those are casualties occur before like midday, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. By that stage, the battle it's clear it's such a disaster that
wave after wave of men,
and because it was pre-planned, and because communications were so rudimentary, once this complex process was in place and happening, it was hard to stop it.
Yeah,
it was difficult to call it off.
Yeah, because you're in chaos.
Yeah,
you're in chaos mode anyway. But there's no way of knowing. There's no VAR, is there? There's nothing looking. There's no like. You're not in real time and able to, I suppose, account for what's going on, are you? As a leader, as a general, or whatever, you can't go right. You back here. You've just got to go. That's the plan. Off you go.
Yeah,
that's what was so devastating about it, I suppose.
But saying this guy Malins, the guy Jeffrey Malins filming this, he also, in the preparation for the film, he sent off those. He'd filmed in the preceding days as well.
Right.
But some of his most iconic photos and iconic filming, I'll just pop on the table now. I've got a couple of them, so just come out.
Mm-hmm.
These guys are soldiers from the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers, and they are in a place called the Sunken Lane. Now, why this position is important in the bit that we're looking at, the little bit we're looking at, this is overlooked by Hawthorne Ridge. When you stand at Hawthorne Ridge, at that crater that's just been blown into the hillside by this mine being detonated, that's now lined with German machine gunners.
Right.
They look down at the sunken lane, and they can't see these soldiers in the sunken lane because it's a sunken lane.
Right.
But as soon as they step out of the sunken lane, they are immediately visible to the German machine gunners, about 300 to 400 metres away, 500 metres most.
Right.
And what will happen is the German machine gunners are sitting in their trench. They're facing the British lines that way, so the British lines are all over here, but Hawthorne Ridge faces the sunken lane that way.
Right.
So as those British soldiers get out, they advance through a cone of machine gun fire. So it's not what you imagine in those pictures, like rat-tat-tat-tat backwards and forwards along a line.
No.
It's the line advances and the gunfire is oblique.
Oh, my God.
And then beyond that, there's oblique gunfire going the other way. The people in Hawthorne Ridge are protected by machine gunners on other positions, firing across in front of them.
Oh, no.
So I was saying, when you're at the Somme and you see where all the German positions are, they're all what we call in military mutually supporting.
Right.
I can't see your trench.
Right.
But I know when the British are attacking it, from my trench and from the trench over there, I can shoot the British down before they even see you.
Oh, no. And
these men are being filmed by Jeffrey Malins maybe within an hour before they assault out of...
And 99% of these guys have just been obliterated.
Well, yeah, they're just... I'll put another one down.
Go on.
They're quite grainy images, but if you look on the internet, you can get a digitally enhanced version of the film, The Somme.
Yeah.
And you can see these guys, and if you're a lip reader, I'm not, but a guy called Peter Barton worked with a lady who was... she worked in crime... she's deaf, worked in crime, lip reading CCTV to see what people are saying.
Okay.
And she goes through this, and they've got testimony now of what the troops are saying to each other, like, "Hey up, Jack, I'll see you on the other side," and this sort of thing. And they're quite light-hearted. Right. But then they go out, and there's one very, very famous character who... I'll just put this on the table. This guy.
Who's this?
This is a guy called Geoffrey Boothby.
Geoffrey Boothby.
And he was in the Lancashire Fusiliers. He's in the second wave.
Right.
But he survived the battle. He survived Gallipoli as well. They'd fought at Gallipoli in 1915 in Turkey.
Right.
And he'd survived Gallipoli. And he got to the front. He's been promoted to corporal, and he's one of the few surviving people who gave testimony and had it recorded.
Right.
And it was once again this guy Peter Barton.
Yeah.
No, Peter Hart. Sorry, Professor Peter Hart was working at the Imperial War Museum. And if you go onto the Imperial War Museum site, you can hear Geoffrey Boothby's testimony as Peter Hart is interviewing him. You hear him speaking.
Oh, really?
And it's absolutely fantastic. You see the Maylands film. You can see this picture of him.
Oh.
You can read his book, My Bit, The Lancashire Fusilier at War,
Right.
and you can hear him being interviewed. It's fantastic.
We will put a link to this in the comment section. Please do take a look at it, because it's if you know,
It's superb. It's if you're as nerdy as I am about it, to hear the voice of the person who was there is fantastic. It's fantastic. But anyway, so Boothby, and I think you've got some testimony.
Yeah,
we're going to read later on. But I've got some testimony from Boothby which I'd like to share. I won't read it all out to you. But I just need to change my glasses, unfortunately, because I'm a man of a certain age. I've got a bus pass now as well, you know.
Bus pass. Oh, lucky.
So, just to put it into perspective,
Yep.
he's in the second cohort of the second wave of the attack. The first people are out in front of the British trenches in the sunken lane.
Yeah.
So the mine's gone off 10 minutes early. The whistle blast has been given. The soldiers have made the assaults. The first wave have gone out, and he's now in the second wave coming up. Okay?
Yep.
So here we are. I'll read through. When we reached the front line trench, there was no need to climb out of the top. It was already battered flat and our wire was blown to fragments. 2/3 of the way across no man's land, holding my head down as I ran to shield my face, the bullets made a horrible hissing noise all around me, and huge shells screamed down on us, shaking the ground under my feet and blowing to pieces both wounded and dead men lying around. And eventually, he gets to the sunken lane, and he arrives in the sunken lane. And bear in mind, the first wave had gone out, and some of the survivors from that first wave, they've been pretty much annihilated, as you said. They didn't get more than about 50 yards,
right.
and they're all finished. They've managed to get back into the lane. So he's reached the sunken lane. He goes, "My God, what a sight! The whole road was strewn with dead and dying men. Some were talking deliriously, others calling for help or water. I heard a voice quite close to me calling Corporal. There I recognised one of my boys, his face deathly pale and his tunic saturated with blood. Quickly I held my water bottle to his lips. He just drank a little and then smiled up at me, awaiting death." And the colonel, and this is this is true. This isn't as crazy as it sounds. The colonel of the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers was a gentleman called Colonel Maniac.
Get out.
Magniac, Maniac. So their regiment was led by Maniac, which you see is bad. But I heard the colonel calling out for a signaller. And bear in mind, signals these days, they want a radio operator who's a man with flags, with semaphore.
Oh.
I heard the colonel calling out for a signaller. "Get up onto that top of the bank as a signal for some reinforcements, quickly." As the signaller raised his flags to send the first letter, the brave fellow dropped back into the lane, riddled with bullets. The picture of that gallant hero's brave action will never leave my memory. And then he goes on. The colonel's voice rang out again. "Now, men, as soon as I give the word, over you go again. And this time, don't stop." Then, jumping out of the lane, he called at the top of his voice, "Come on." And that's like the testimony for somebody who was actually there.
Wow.
I didn't read all of it, but as we pushed forward, we stepped over mortally wounded men who tried to grab our legs.
Oh.
It is unbelievable. That's the thing, isn't it?
It's stuff of horror. It's like it's so dark and it's so mindless and inhuman and barbaric and in every level. It's just abhorrent, and you can't. There's no way to imagine it as. We've all had. I imagine. I know. You've been through various things in life. I've been through various. I've been through trauma, But on that scale, there's where do you go from there? I mean, what pointless action as well.
But I don't know. I agree very much, and certainly from my perspective, and it's a cliche we use in battlefield touring and battlefield guiding: walking the ground. When you see the ground and you see the positions, and you have testimony, and you put the two or three together, you have that visual and the auditory, and you have, I think, more than anything, you get empathy about not so much the horror, but the hopelessness of situations and the pressure and the distress that people were in. And you of all of those things, I think it's that empathy, it's that I'm slowly having a degree of understanding of what you experienced. It's quite a vicarious, sort of distant one, and it's not something that I romanticise really. No, I just think it's horrible that
I know.
This is what happened in this location.
And I suppose that's kind of what inspired me, I suppose, to question you on this and to talk to you about this, and knowing how much you invest your life in going to these places. And you do, for years that I've known you, you have invested your time and your life into going and being at these places. And touching on that just a little bit, and aside from the kind of, you have served and you have been in these, these heightened situations, what keeps you going back? What just to unpick that a little bit, it's what, because it's not morbid.
It's not morbid. It doesn't have a morbid sort of side to it. And in some ways, it's a question I find quite hard to answer because I'm certainly that person. I'm very, very interested in military things. I find myself tiring of it, and I don't find it interesting when films about military things are based entirely around shocking, violent, mutilating, horrible gore. Some people are really motivated by that. Sure. It was a cracking film. Do you see that man getting blown to? Yeah. I find that disinteresting. It's just not what I want to see.
But where does it come from? Where does it come from?
Yeah, the thing that's sort of, for me, I find quite hard to answer. It's quite hard. When in history have ordinary people commemorated people they've never met from generations before they were born? Yeah, and still we have this empathy with that generation. We still commemorate the 11th of November. Last year and the year before, I was fortunate enough to be at the Cenotaph on the 11th of November both years, and it's really quite spiritual. It's quite emotive. Or you're under the Menin Gate in Ypres when they're playing The Last Post, and the acoustics are fantastic, and you're surrounded by a monument with 53,000 names on it for people who have no known grave. They were just lost in the morass of this battle, and you're there. And you're almost like it's like not a homage because you don't know them, but it's a testimony. In many ways, I suspect it might be like Jewish people having an empathy with the Holocaust. Of course, there's a link. You have to bear testimony to this, bear witness to it, because it is of such significance. And the longer that continues, it is depressing. I admit, I agree, it is depressing that since then we've had multiple conflicts. There's not been a year in which British Armed Forces personnel have not died since 1918, and that's
a whole new podcast.
Yeah, we don't learn the lessons of history.
No, we don't. We never do. But it's just fascinating for me to understand that, and why that would be a thing that you.
You've got some testimony there from the other side of the wire.
Yeah, it's
important to see the other side of the wire.
It really is, of course, and that's why I suppose we can, in your research that you've done, we can do that, and that's like seeing that because and we want to talk as well about the fact that
it's not the binary good guys and bad guys, the winners and the losers.
It very much isn't, is it? And this is what we're going to touch on in a later podcast, obviously, as well. But this is from the Beaumont Hamel, July the 1st.
That's the first day of the battle.
The first day of the battle. And this guy's Gefertier Moritz Weber, and he's
it's a corporal, Gefreiter, corporal.
Oh, Gefreiter.
Gefreiter, corporal.
A corporal, okay.
Yeah, corporal rank.
And he's the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment, Württemberger.
Württemberg. It's a German province.
Württemberg
area.
Okay, so being a German province, akin to sort of.
Yeah, it's like being he's from Norfolk or Northumbria or
Lombardy
Cornwall.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And this is his direct words, translated obviously. Yeah. We had been underground for days and nights, packed tight in our dugouts, as the British drum fire screamed above us. The ground shook constantly, and the dust filtered down from the roof. We waited, smoked in silence, and listened for the signs we all knew would come. At dawn, the bombardment lifted, suddenly. For a moment, it seemed silent, like the war itself had gone still. My
Feldwebel. Sergeant.
Okay. My sergeant barked. To the parapets, we scrambled up, the light hitting us in the face, and looked across no man's land. They were coming, hundreds, thousands maybe, in lines, upright, steady. I thought for a second they were on parade, such order, such madness. Fire at will, came the cry, and then the machine guns opened up. The rattle was deafening. Our barrels glowed red after just minutes. They dropped like wheat. Still, they kept coming. More lines, more figures. Some tangled in their own barbed wire, some never even reached it. Others got close. We shot them point blank. By midday, the ground in front of our trench was covered in bodies. We didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like butchery. We stayed alert, expecting more waves, but they never came. After nightfall, we heard moans from no man's land. Their wounded called out in English, a few in French. We were ordered not to go out. I still remember their voices. I mean,
no,
that is
the phrase in the resignation is, it's not victory. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like butchery.
It felt like butchery. Well, it is butchery. It is.
He was on the winning team that day. He survived. However, it didn't feel like victory.
I mean, you there is from both sides, and this is what
it's a tragedy for both. There's no doubt whatsoever.
I mean, when you say tragedy, tragedy. In this case, I suppose it is, because tragedy in the classical sense is when the person who dies actually sees their death coming, and these people are experiencing that.
Yeah, it's.
Well, I mean, the scale of this is just. Will it happen again? Was that the end of that kind of? Have we seen battle like that ever?
Well, it's not too dissimilar to what's happening in Ukraine.
Well, on this scale,
in numbers of people being killed, it's all entrenched. It's an attritional war. Neither side has got the combat power to defeat the other in decisive battle.
But not on this scale per day.
No,
you're not getting like a loose term cannon fodder. You're not seeing
the British attritional rate was somewhere in the region of about 300 casualties a day, spread across the whole of the war,
right?
Sort of thing. So to just to run the office, you're losing 300 casualties a day, sort of thing. That's the rough, and you got to feed the people you got there. You got to supply them with ammunition. Right? It's a mechanistic. It's often referred to as industrialised warfare, right? Sort of thing. But that's pretty not too dissimilar to what you've got in Ukraine. You've got a massive country called Russia with its immense combat power, right? But it's not been able to prevail. You've got a country like Ukraine, smaller, but supported by some allies with it, not able to prevail. In old cameras. Let's look at something like the Battle of Waterloo.
Okay.
Napoleon comes back from Elba, invades France, gets back in power, decides he's going to rekindle his fighting and go and defeat his enemies. He'll duff up the British and the Prussians separately, but it all ends up in decisive battle. The Battle of Waterloo is the decisive engagement, and then one side has won. In Ukraine, we haven't got decisive engagement.
No.
The Somme isn't part of a plan of decisive engagement. Haig, the guy who's in charge of all of this,
Yeah.
is the sort of immediate general is Rawlinson, but Haig, the big gaffer, sort of thing. He has, like I say, he's referred to as Butcher Haig by some people, and there's a whole story behind that that's very interesting. But he has optimism bias. He's got to have that. He's got to have the belief that just one more go, we're going to get it right this time. And to be honest, even though the first day of the Battle of the Somme is such a disaster, you have to see it in the perspective of, so today we've buggered it up, but there's tomorrow, and there's next week, and there's the week after, and the week after, and we'll have another go, and we'll work it out, and we'll sort it out, and we'll learn from the failure, and we'll make progress, and we'll get better. The terror in that, the horror part of that, is that people lose their lives in that process.
Yeah, of course.
We wouldn't operate a factory where we'll just keep using the same lathes until we've worked out how to use them, and every now and again people are losing an arm or a leg.
No.
We put safety guards, we do something different to resolve it.
You haven't got that luxury in war, have you?
In that war. But the Somme, sure enough, by the end of the Somme campaign in the autumn, and it's one of the sort of analyses of the Somme, is it's the battle period where the British Army learned to fight.
Okay.
Because our professional and trained armies and Empire and Dominion armies have kind of been used up to this point. The new army is here now, and the new army now learns to fight.
Right. So
the victories that come in 1918 really kind of, the process is starting to be learned in 1916.
That had to happen.
Yeah,
to get to the point.
It's slightly off the subject, should we say, but it's a good. I mean, I say it's an analogy. Currently in Britain, public services, very often people are very disappointed with public services like the NHS and whatever, because there are too many managers in the NHS. Is a very common cry. That's a debatable point, because in the army, those organisational managerial roles are run by people called staff officers.
Yeah.
When the general says we're going to do this and shapes his finger across the map, it's the staff officers that go away and design the logistics plan, the engineering plans, the artillery fire plans, the training programs for the troops. All of those staff officers that make the thing work have to learn how to make the thing work.
Right, yeah.
They don't have a manual they can follow immediately. Yeah. They have to write the manual as they're learning how to do it.
Yeah.
And then in subsequent years, there is a kind of manual. And so other officers can come in and fit into these roles and make an effective staff, an effective organisation that takes the general's plan to the battlefield to delivering the kinetic outcome. Because without that bit in the middle, it don't work. And that's in some ways, like you say, why don't public services work in many parts of Britain? In economy savings, we've whittled away that organisational bridge.
Yeah.
So the frontline nurses are working their pants off. The politicians are saying, do this, do that, do the other. But there's not enough in the middle to translate that to that.
Yeah.
And that's the staff officer thing that the British Army learn on the Somme. They learn how to be better at being an army.
Wow. That's enough for this. That's been fascinating, and again, thank you for your knowledge. And
no problem at all. I really enjoy it. It's a big advantage of being a bit nerdy.
Well, there we go. If you'd like to get in touch, please do. Like, subscribe to our channel. Please do comment. Get in touch in the comments, and I'm sure all the links to what we've been discussing and things that we find might be of interest to yourself, we can pass on and put in our comments. And please do get in touch. We're going to do more of these. We're going to go through the First World War, and then probably by the next series we'll be on Second World War and up to the modern era, and of course we'll be picking apart other kind of battles and warfare throughout history, because Phil's not just a British Army nerd, as he says. He actually does the whole history and the full global gambit. So thank you very much. Goodbye from Phil, goodbye from me, and we'll see you next time.